Amos Drummond stood perfectly still, one foot suspended 3 inches above the forest floor, his entire body frozen in mid-step. 30 yards ahead, a grizzly bear moved through the pine trees, its massive head swinging side to side as it tested the air for scent. Between Amos and safety lay a carpet of dry autumn branches, each one a potential betrayal that would announce his presence to 800 pounds of predator. He had learned this lesson once before, and it had cost a man's life. Before we continue, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and if you're enjoying these frontier survival stories, hit that subscribe button. Tomorrow's episode covers a technique so dangerous that only 3 men ever attempted it and lived. The elk had been moving through the valley for nearly an hour, a magnificent bull with antlers that would have brought premium payment at any trading post from Street Lewis to Fort Vancouver. Amos Drummond and William Harding had been tracking the animal since dawn, moving carefully through the Montana wilderness on that October morning in 1839. The air was cold enough to show their breath, and the forest floor was covered in the dry detritus of autumn, leaves and twigs and pine needles that crunched underfoot if a man wasn't careful. Amos was careful. Will was confident. They had been partners for 2 seasons, working the beaver streams that fed into the Yellowstone River. Will was the better shot, could drop a deer at 100 yards with his Hawken rifle. Amos was the better tracker, could read sign that other men would miss entirely. Together they made a functional team, and they had survived longer than most men who came west chasing fur money and freedom. The elk was feeding in a small meadow surrounded by dense pine forest. Amos and Will had circled downwind, approaching through the trees with their rifles ready. The animal was 60 yards away, broadside, an easy shot for Will. Amos stepped carefully, testing each footfall before committing his weight. Will moved faster, eager to close the distance, focused entirely on the elk. The branch that snapped under Will's boot was no thicker than a man's thumb, just a piece of deadfall hidden beneath a layer of pine needles. The sound it made was sharp and distinct, a crack that carried across the meadow and into the forest beyond. The elk's head jerked up instantly, but the elk wasn't the problem. The grizzly had been feeding on a deer carcass 40 yards upslope, hidden in a dense thicket of young pines. When the branch snapped, the bear's head rose from the carcass. It saw the 2 men immediately. The bear was a male, probably weighing 700 pounds, in prime condition after a summer of feeding. It charged. Will never saw it coming. He was still watching the elk. Amos saw the bear immediately, the massive animal crashing through the underbrush with terrifying speed. He shouted a warning, bringing his rifle up, but the distance was too close and the bear was too fast. Will turned at Amos's shout, saw the bear, tried to swing his rifle around. The bear covered 40 yards in less than 4 seconds. The impact when the bear hit Will was like watching a man struck by a falling tree. Amos fired, the shot echoing across the valley, but his aim was hurried and the ball struck the bear in the shoulder rather than a vital area. The wound only enraged the animal. The bear mauled Will with systematic brutality. Will screamed once, a sound that cut off abruptly. Amos was reloading, his hands shaking, knowing he wouldn't be fast enough. The bear looked up at him, blood on its muzzle, then turned and crashed back into the forest. Amos reached his partner within seconds, but Will was dead. Amos knelt beside the body and understood with complete clarity how quickly sound could kill. Amos buried William Harding on a hillside overlooking the valley, where he died. He wrapped the body in a wool blanket, dug the grave with a claist, small folding shovel from their supply cache, and marked it with stones arranged in a cross pattern. The work took most of the afternoon. He said no words over the grave because he didn't know what words would matter. Will was dead because of a sound, because of one careless step, because neither of them had been paying attention to what was behind them instead of what was ahead. Amos returned to their camp alone as darkness fell. The camp consisted of a small lean-to shelter, a fire ring, and their combined supplies spread between 2 canvas packs. He built a fire and sat watching the flames, not eating, not sleeping, just replaying the morning's events with obsessive detail. The snap of the branch, the bear's charge, Will's scream. Every moment was crystallized in his memory with painful clarity. He tried to sleep, but couldn't. His mind kept circling back to the sound. That single crack of breaking wood had announced their presence to a predator they hadn't known was there. If Will had stepped differently, if the branch hadn't broken, the elk might have spooked, but they would both still be alive. Sound had betrayed them. Sound had killed his partner as surely as the bear's claws. When dawn came, Amos walked through the forest near camp and noticed something he had never paid attention to before. Every step he took made noise. The crunch of pine needles, the snap of small twigs, the rustle of dry leaves. He was announcing his presence with every movement, broadcasting his location to anything within hearing distance. He had always known he made sound while walking, but he had never considered it a problem worth solving. Now, it seemed like the most dangerous thing he did. Amos spent that day walking in circles around the camp, trying to move quietly. He failed repeatedly. Even when he stepped carefully, something always made noise. He tried stepping slowly, lifting his feet high, placing them gently. Still, the forest floor betrayed him with cracks and crunches. He became frustrated, then angry, then grimly determined. Over the next week, he began watching animals. He saw a deer moving through thick brush without making a sound. He watched a fox cross a debris field that would have announced Amos's presence from 50 yards away, but the fox passed through in complete silence. Even a black bear he observed from a safe distance moved with surprising quiet despite its size. These animals traveled the same forest floor Amos did, but they knew something he didn't. He decided he would learn what they knew. It wasn't about hunting anymore. It wasn't about trapping beaver or making money or any of the reasons he had come west. It was about survival. It was about not dying the way Will had died, announced by sound to dangers he couldn't see. Amos Drummond became obsessed with silence. Amos began his education by simply looking down. For years he had walked through forests, watching the horizon, scanning for game or threats, navigating by landmarks and terrain features. Now he studied the ground itself with the intensity of a scholar examining ancient texts. The forest floor, he realized, was not a uniform surface but a complex landscape of different materials, each with its own properties regarding sound. He started cataloging what he observed. Dry pine needles, the kind that covered much of the Montana forest in autumn, were treacherous. They compressed under weight and produced a distinctive crunching sound that carried surprisingly far in still air. Fresh pine needles, still green or recently fallen, were slightly better but still unreliable. Leaves were worse than needles, crackling and rustling with even careful steps. Moss, however, was silent. Amos discovered that patches of moss growing on the forest floor absorbed footfalls completely, producing no sound regardless of how he stepped. The problem was that moss grew in scattered patches, not continuous paths, and required detours that weren't always practical. But the discovery was important. It proved that silent movement was possible if he could identify the right surfaces. Exposed rock was silent but rare and often slippery. Tree roots, where they crossed the forest floor, provided solid stepping points that didn't produce sound. Amos began noticing these roots everywhere, seeing them as a network of silent pathways through otherwise noisy terrain. Rotting logs were deceptive. They looked solid but often crumbled under weight, producing soft thuds and the sound of breaking punk wood. Fresh deadfall, branches recently fallen from trees, were the worst offenders. They snapped with sharp cracks that announced a man's presence across remarkable distances. Amos spent entire days walking short distances, testing different surfaces, learning which could be trusted and which couldn't. He began to see patterns. Areas near streams had damper ground that muffled sound. North-facing slopes retained moisture longer and were generally quieter than Asri 4. South-facing slopes where sun dried everything quickly. Dense forest with thick canopy cover protected the forest floor from wind and sun, keeping it damper and quieter than open areas. He learned that time of day mattered. Early morning, when dew still dampened the forest floor, was the quietest time to move. Midday, after sun had dried everything, was the loudest. Rain transformed the forest into a silent pathway where almost any surface became quiet, but rain also reduced visibility and scent, creating different trade-offs. Amos carried his walking staff everywhere now, using it not just for balance but as a testing tool. He would extend the staff ahead of him and press it against the ground, checking for hidden branches beneath surface debris, testing whether leaves concealed solid ground or loose material. The staff became an extension of his awareness, probing the forest floor before he committed his weight to any step. After 3 weeks of this obsessive study, Amos had developed what he thought of as a mental map of forest floor types. He could glance at terrain and make reasonable predictions about which paths would be quiet and which would betray him. Understanding which surfaces were quiet was only half the problem. Amos discovered that how he placed his feet mattered as much as where he placed them. His usual walking pattern, the natural gait he had used his entire life, was fundamentally incompatible with silent movement. He had to relearn how to walk. Normal walking involved striking the ground, heel first, rolling forward through the foot, and pushing off with the toes. This pattern worked well for efficient travel on trails or open ground, but it created concentrated pressure points that snapped hidden branches and compressed noisy material. When Amos stepped heel first onto a bed of pine needles, his heel acted like a hammer, driving downward with his full body weight focused on a small area. Branches hidden beneath the needles snapped before he even realized they were there. He experimented with different approaches. He tried stepping toe first like walking on tiptoes, but this required constant calf muscle tension and was exhausting to maintain for more than a few minutes. He tried stepping with his whole foot flat, placing it down all at once, but this felt awkward and unnatural, and he couldn't maintain balance on uneven terrain. The solution came from watching how he instinctively moved when he was trying to peek over a ridge without being seen. In those situations, he naturally rolled his foot from the outside edge inward, gradually transferring weight rather than planting it all at once. This distributed pressure across a larger area and allowed him to detect problems before committing full weight. If he felt a branch beginning to bend under partial weight, he could shift to a different placement before it snapped. Amos began practicing this rolling step deliberately. He would lift his foot, place the outside edge down first, then gradually roll inward across the ball of his foot, distributing weight progressively. The technique allowed him to test the ground with partial weight before committing fully. If something felt wrong, a slight give that suggested hidden debris or unstable material, he could redirect mid-step without producing sound. The practice was mentally exhausting. Every step required conscious thought and careful execution. His natural walking instinct fought against the new pattern constantly. He would catch himself reverting to heel-first steps and have to correct deliberately. But gradually, over days of focused practice, the rolling step began to feel less foreign. His muscles developed memory for the movement. His balance adjusted to the new weight distribution. Amos also realized his boots were working against him. Standard frontier boots were built for durability and protection, with thick, rigid soles and stiff leather uppers. The stiffness prevented his feet from flexing naturally during the rolling step. He needed to feel the ground through his boots, needed to sense whether he was stepping on something that might produce sound. He spent 2 days modifying his boots, working saddle soap into the leather to soften it, thinning the soles slightly with his knife, and adding flexibility to the uppers by cutting and restitching certain sections. The modified boots felt strange at first, less protective, but they allowed tactile feedback he couldn't get before. Amos discovered that mastering silent movement in autumn conditions meant nothing when winter arrived. The forest floor transformed completely with the first heavy snow in November of 1839, and every technique he had developed required adaptation. Snow muffled sound beautifully, but it also recorded every footprint with perfect clarity, creating a different kind of betrayal. A man could move silently through snow, but couldn't move invisibly. The trade-off forced Amos to reconsider what silence meant in different contexts. Winter snow came in varieties that affected sound differently. Fresh powder was perfectly silent but exhausting to walk through, requiring high steps that tired the legs quickly. Crusted snow, where freezing rain had created a hard surface layer, was treacherous. It would support a man's weight for several steps, then suddenly break through with a loud crunch that announced his presence across vast distances. Amos learned to test crusted snow with his staff before each step, probing for weak spots and choosing paths where the crust was thickest. Spring brought the opposite problem. Snowmelt saturated the forest floor, turning it into a silent paradise for movement, but making fire starting difficult and creating hypothermia risks from constant dampness. Amos could walk for miles without producing a sound, but he left deep tracks in mud and disturbed wet leaves in ways that were obvious to anyone tracking him. Spring also brought bears out of hibernation, hungry and unpredictable, making silent movement more important even as the conditions made it easier. Summer dried everything. By July, the Montana forest floor became a minefield of noise. Every step produced sound unless Amos was extraordinarily careful. Dry grass rustled, baked earth cracked. Twigs that would have been flexible in spring snapped like gunshots under any weight. Summer forced Amos to move slower than any other season, testing each step multiple times, finding the rare patches of remaining dampness near streams or in deep shade where quiet movement was possible. But summer also taught him about timing. He discovered that early morning, before the sun had been up for more than an hour, the forest retained enough overnight dampness to remain relatively quiet. Late evening, after dew began forming, offered similar conditions. Midday was nearly impossible for silent movement, so Amos adjusted his patterns, traveling during dawn and dusk hours, and resting during the middle of the day. Autumn, when Will had died, remained the most challenging season. Fallen leaves covered everything in a crackling blanket that seemed designed to announce human presence. Amos learned to look for game trails where deer and elk had compressed leaves into relatively quiet paths. He learned that leaves were quieter when slightly damp from morning dew or light rain, and that stepping on the compressed leaves immediately next to logs or rocks was quieter than stepping on loose piles. Each season demanded different techniques, different awareness, and different compromises. Amos realized he wasn't learning a single skill, but rather a collection of related skills that required constant adaptation. The forest was not a static environment, but a dynamic system that changed daily, and silent movement required responding to those changes intelligently. The buck was a 4-point mule deer, cautious and alert, feeding in a small clearing surrounded by dense pine forest. Amos spotted the animal from 200 yards away in early December of 1839, nearly 2 months after Will's death. The deer was moving slowly through scattered patches of browse, stopping frequently to raise its head and scan for threats. This was exactly the kind of animal that would vanish at the slightest disturbance, and the terrain between Amos and the deer was covered in dry branches and frost-stiffened grass. Amos studied the route he would need to take. Direct approach was impossible. The clearing offered no cover, and the deer would see him immediately. He would need to circle through the forest, staying hidden in the trees and close to within 60 yards for a reliable shot. The distance was roughly half a mile of careful movement through some of the noisiest terrain he had encountered. Under normal circumstances, he would have given up and looked for different game. But this wasn't about efficiency anymore. This was a test. He began moving, using every technique he had developed over the past weeks. He extended his walking staff ahead, testing the ground before each step. He identified patches of moss and solid ground, planning his route several steps in advance. When he had to cross areas covered in deadfall, he moved with excruciating slowness, placing each foot with the rolling motion he had practiced, distributing his weight gradually, ready to shift if he felt anything beginning to give way beneath him. The stalk took nearly an hour to cover what would normally be 15 minutes of walking. Amos moved in complete silence, testing each surface, choosing each step with deliberate care. Several times, he had to detour around particularly dense areas of branches, adding distance but maintaining quiet. He kept the wind in his face, ensuring his scent wouldn't reach the deer. He paused frequently, watching the animal to ensure it remained calm and unaware. At 70 yards, Amos found a position behind a thick pine tree that offered a clear shooting lane. He was breathing hard from the concentration required, but the deer was still feeding peacefully, completely unaware of his presence. He had crossed half a mile of treacherous terrain without making a single sound that had alerted the animal. The technique worked. Amos raised his rifle slowly, resting the barrel against the tree trunk for stability. He aligned the sights on the deer's chest, just behind the front shoulder. The animal took 2 steps forward, broadside, perfect positioning. Amos squeezed the trigger. The rifle's crack echoed across the clearing. The deer jumped at the shot, ran 20 yards, and collapsed. Amos approached the animal and confirmed the kill. Clean shot, instant death, no suffering. He knelt beside the deer and felt something release inside him that had been clenched tight since Will died. This meat would feed him through part of the winter. More importantly, he had proven that silent movement was possible, that the skill he had been developing actually worked in practical application. The grizzly was 50 yards away when Amos first saw it, and he understood immediately that he was in serious danger. It was early March of 1840. Spring thaw had begun, but patches of snow still covered the ground in shaded areas. Amos had been checking his trap line along a creek that fed into the Yellowstone, working his way upstream through dense forest. He had been focused on the traps, not paying enough attention to his surroundings, and he had walked into a situation that could kill him. The bear was a large male, probably just emerged from hibernation, hungry and irritable. It was feeding on something Amos couldn't see clearly, probably a winter-killed elk or deer that had thawed enough to provide accessible meat. The bear hadn't noticed Amos yet, its attention completely focused on its meal. But the wind was shifting unpredictably, swirling in the creek valley, and Amos knew that within minutes the scent would reach the animal. He needed to retreat. The terrain behind him was a nightmare for silent movement, a slope covered in deadfall and scattered rocks, with patches of dry leaves showing through melting snow. Under normal circumstances, any attempt to move through that terrain would produce enough noise to alert the bear immediately. A bear defending a food source was among the most dangerous situations a man could face in the wilderness. The animal would interpret any approach as a threat or competition. Amos took a slow breath and began moving backward. He kept his eyes on the bear while simultaneously watching where he placed each foot, a split attention that required intense concentration. He extended his walking staff behind him, probing the ground before each step, identifying obstacles he couldn't see directly. He placed his right foot down carefully, rolling from outside edge inward, testing the ground with partial weight. Solid. He shifted his weight fully and brought his left foot back. The bear raised its head suddenly, looking in his direction. Amos froze completely, one foot still in the air. The bear stared toward him for 10 seconds that felt like minutes. Amos didn't breathe, didn't move, became absolutely still. The bear eventually returned its attention to feeding. Amos completed his step in absolute silence. He continued backward, step by careful step, navigating through the deadfall by feel and memory. A branch lay across his intended path. He lifted his foot higher, cleared the branch, placed his foot on a small patch of exposed ground beyond it. His staff touched a loose rock. He adjusted his angle, found solid ground beside the rock. The bear looked up twice more during his retreat, each time forcing Amos to freeze mid-movement. But the animal never committed to investigating. After 20 minutes of the most careful movement of his life, Amos had put 80 yards between himself and the bear. The terrain improved slightly, offering better footing and fewer obstacles. He continued moving until he had covered 200 yards, then finally turned and walked normally, heading back toward his camp with legs shaking from released tension and sustained muscle control. Daniel Whitmore arrived in the Montana Territory in April of 1841, a young trapper, barely 20 years old, full of confidence and completely unprepared for the realities of mountain life. He had come west from Pennsylvania with romantic notions about wilderness, freedom, and making his fortune in furs. He had basic skills, could shoot reasonably well, knew how to set traps, but he moved through the forest like a traveling circus, announcing his presence with every step. Amos encountered Daniel at a seasonal trading camp where trappers gathered to exchange furs, buy supplies, and share information before dispersing back into the wilderness. Daniel was working a trap line about 15 miles from Amos's territory, and he had already survived 2 close encounters with grizzly bears through sheer luck rather than skill. He asked Amos directly one evening around a campfire how he managed to move so quietly through the forest. The question surprised Amos. He had become so accustomed to his silent movement techniques that he rarely thought about them consciously anymore. The skills had become automatic, integrated into how he moved through the world. Explaining them to someone else required thinking through the entire process deliberately, breaking down instinctive actions into teachable steps. Amos spent 3 days with Daniel, teaching him the fundamentals. He started with observation. showing Daniel how to read the forest floor, identifying which surfaces would betray footsteps and which could be trusted. Daniel struggled with this initially, unable to distinguish between different types of ground cover, but gradually his eyes adjusted. He began noticing patterns he had walked past for months without seeing. The foot placement technique was harder to teach. Daniel's natural walking gait was heel first and heavy, the stride of a young man who had never considered that movement itself could be dangerous. Amos demonstrated the rolling step repeatedly, showing how to place the outside edge of the foot first and gradually transfer weight inward. Daniel tried to mimic the movement, but felt clumsy and unnatural. His balance was wrong, his weight distribution was incorrect. Amos had Daniel practice for hours, walking short distances back and forth across various terrain types, focusing entirely on foot placement rather than distance covered. He made Daniel slow down to quarter speed, executing each step with deliberate precision until the motion began to feel less foreign. Daniel's legs ached from using muscles in unfamiliar ways. His concentration wavered. But slowly, over repeated practice, improvement appeared. By the third day, Daniel could move with reasonable quiet across favorable terrain. He was nowhere near Amos's level of skill, and he would need months of practice to develop the instinctive awareness that allowed truly silent movement. But he understood the principles. More importantly, he understood why the skill mattered. Amos told him about will, about the branch that snapped and the bear that charged. Daniel listened with the attention of a man who realized how close he had come to dying from his own carelessness. When they parted ways, Daniel thanked Amos and promised to keep practicing. Amos watched him disappear into the forest, moving more carefully than he had 3 days earlier, and felt something unexpected. Teaching the skill had honored Will's memory more than the grave marker ever could. Word traveled slowly through the scattered trapping communities of the northern Rockies, carried by men who met at trading posts and seasonal camps, shared around evening fires, and passed along through the informal networks that connected isolated wilderness workers. By the summer of 1842, trappers throughout the region had heard about Amos Drummond's silent movement technique, though most had never met him personally, and the stories had accumulated embellishments with each retelling. Some claimed Amos could walk across a bed of dry leaves without producing a sound. Others said he could approach within arm's reach of a deer without the animal detecting him. A few stories suggested he could move past grizzly bears so quietly that the animals never knew he was there. Most of these tales were exaggerations, but they contained kernels of truth that made them believable to men who understood how dangerous careless movement could be in the wilderness. The technique itself became known by various names depending on which trapping community was discussing it. Some called it ghost walking. Others referred to it as the silent step or quiet foot technique. A few simply called it the Drummond method. The terminology varied, but the underlying principles remained consistent across different versions. Careful observation of terrain, deliberate foot placement, weight distribution, and constant awareness of what surfaces would betray sound. Not every trapper who heard about the technique bothered to learn it. Many dismissed it as too slow, too cautious, unnecessary for men who were competent with rifles and confident in their wilderness skills. These men continued moving through the forest with their usual efficiency, covering distance quickly, making noise they considered irrelevant. Some of them died. Others survived through luck or fighting ability when their noise attracted unwanted attention. But those who had experienced close calls with bears, or who had lost partners to wilderness accidents, or who simply understood that survival required every possible advantage, these men sought out information about the technique and began practicing it. Daniel Whitmore, now an experienced trapper himself, taught the method to 2 other young trappers working his region. A man named Marcus Holt, who had survived a grizzly attack that killed his hunting partner, traveled 60 miles specifically to find Amos and learn the technique directly. Amos never sought credit or recognition for developing the method. He shared information freely with anyone who asked, demonstrating the principles and offering advice, but he never promoted himself or claimed special expertise. To him, silent movement was simply a practical skill he had learned out of necessity, no different than knowing how to read weather signs or treat a wound. The fact that other men found it valuable enough to adopt was satisfying, but not something that required acknowledgement. By 1843, the technique had spread widely enough that experienced trappers in the northern Rockies generally knew about it, even if they didn't all practice it. The skill had become part of the accumulated wilderness knowledge that separated men who survived from men who didn't. Amos Drummond's name was attached to it in some circles, forgotten in others, but the technique itself persisted because it solved a real problem that killed real people. Amos Drummond left the Rocky Mountains in the spring of 1844, part of the general exodus of trappers that occurred as the fur trade collapsed under the combined pressures of depleted beaver populations and changing fashion markets that no longer valued felt hats the way previous generations had. He was 33 years old, had survived 7 years in the wilderness, and had saved enough money to purchase a small piece of land in the Oregon Territory, where settlers were establishing farms and ranches in the valleys west of the mountains. Before leaving, Amos returned one final time to the hillside where he had buried William Harding nearly 5 years earlier. The grave marker had weathered but remained intact, the stones still arranged in their cross pattern. Wild flowers grew around the site, and pine seedlings had begun establishing themselves nearby. In another decade, the forest would reclaim this spot completely, erasing all evidence that a man had died here and been buried by his partner. Amos stood beside the grave for a long time, not speaking, just remembering. He thought about the branch that had snapped under Will's boot, the sound that had attracted the bear, and how that single moment had changed the trajectory of his entire life. The obsession that had consumed him for months after Will's death had transformed into a practical skill set that had kept him alive through dozens of dangerous situations. More than that, it had become something he could share with others. A piece of knowledge that might prevent other men from dying the way Will had died. He had never intended to become known for silent movement. He had simply been trying to survive. But the skill had spread beyond him, adopted by trappers he had never met, taught by men he had trained to, other men in distant territories. The technique would outlast him, persisting as long as people needed to move quietly through dangerous terrain. That felt like an appropriate legacy for Will, something more meaningful than a pile of stones on a remote hillside. Amos settled in Oregon and built a successful ranch over the following decades. He married, raised children, and lived the kind of ordinary life that left no dramatic stories for historians to record. He never returned to the mountains. But occasionally, when teaching his sons to hunt in the forested hills near their property, he would demonstrate how to move quietly through dry leaves and deadfall, showing them the rolling step and explaining how to read terrain for sound properties. His sons learned the skill without knowing its origins, without understanding that their father had developed these techniques in response to tragedy. Amos died in 1867 at the age of 56 of natural causes, surrounded by family. His obituary in the local newspaper mentioned his years as a mountain trapper, but included no details about silent movement or wilderness techniques. To his community, he was simply a rancher who had lived quietly and successfully. But in the mountains he had left behind, trappers and hunters continued using the methods he had developed, moving through the forest without breaking twigs, surviving because one man had learned from loss and refused to let that lesson die with him.